Hi, you have already read about imagery, and now you've read also about Imagism. And I wanted to take a little bit of time to talk about the difference between those two, as well as focus on a few concepts from the readings on Imagism that we find particularly important. Because it's a lot of material and it's a lot of historic material, right? It's both William Carlos Williams' Introduction to the Wedge and Ezra Pound's A Few Don'ts are in the style of the Manifesto, um, which has fallen out of favor, but is a very common form for poets to use to describe their poetics that they're developing. So, as you have already read about, imagery is an essential element of figurative language, and it is using any of the five senses to evoke a mental image. Imagism is, we could say it's a movement, we could say it's a school of poetry, but as is the case with most literary and artistic movements, it wasn't necessarily called that in the moment that it was happening. But literary scholars have assigned different writers the title of Imagism based on Pound's definition of Imagism, and different writers' work, and based on the fact that Pound would pronounce the title of Imagist onto certain poets and not others. So just that distinction really quickly. Imagism might contain, imagery, but it's also very specific in its definition, and I wanted to talk a little bit about that. I also just want to acknowledge, I think personally for myself that these kinds of historic texts are really important to know, in the same way that it's important to know history so that you don't repeat it, right? Or where we've come from and been and gone. I think there's a lot of value in Pound's work, in William Carlos Williams' work, in these texts that you've read for today. And, I mean, Ezra Pound is a very complicated person that we will not, give the space to fully unpack his character right now. But, suffice it to say, he was a fascist. I was trying to figure out a way to say that more delicately, but why? He became a big supporter of Mussolini, and ended up being an American prisoner of war, and ended up institutionalized. So fascism can happen anywhere, even in poetry. And I think, there are elements of A Few Don'ts that speak to that, like the title. Yeah. And I think it's been incredibly influential on 20th century American poetry. So I want to start out by reading the definition that Pound gives from A Few Don'ts of an image. He says, an image is that which presents an intellectual and emotional complex in an instant of time. And then later, it is the presentation of such a complex instantaneously which gives that sudden sense of liberation, that sense of freedom from time limits and space limits, that sense of growth, which we experience in the presence of the greatest works of art. So, he's borrowing language from psychology, right, a complex, in order to do this, in order to create this definition. But he's also kind of suggesting a formula to create an experience of the sublime. Sudden liberation, freedom from time limits and space limits, sudden growth. So I think that's interesting. Whether or not we agree with all of the terms in which he thinks are required to create this sense of the sublime, I think is another question. And a lot of this, like what he's saying, I might be like introducing it with this critical lens, but a lot of what he's saying is what we've been taught in creative writing classes for a long time, right? But essentially, a lot of what he's cataloging are the tenets of show don't tell. And that's interesting. It's interesting too because I think there are limitations even to that, right? Show don't tell doesn't want us to use explicit language to say what we mean. It wants us to present it through figurative language. But sometimes direct and explicit language is necessary. Sometimes it's a mix of both. So I think that when you're reading this, I want you to pay attention to, like, what do you agree with, right? Where do you find tension? Because I think that tension is useful, right? As you're reading these texts and finding those places of tension, you're in the process of determining and what you think is a poet and what your own poetics is, right? So he's saying, don't use such an expression as dim lands of peace, it dulls the image. The natural object is always the adequate symbol, or use no superfluous word, no adjective which does not reveal something. Go in fear of abstractions. He says that you can't just break up prose into lines and call it poetry. Although I think that's a really productive writing exercise to try with your own prose that can help as a part of the creative process and the drafting process. But yeah, that poetry is, it has rules too, he wants us to know, that make it legitimate. No, but I mean, I think he really wants poetry to be taken seriously as an art form, even while he's advocating for moving away from the poetry of the metronome, for example. And we're not in the landscape of free verse, but we're well on our way to the landscape of free verse with Pound. So there are many things here that we could focus on. The one thing that I want to take away from this text is an idea that actually isn't Pound's. He didn't come up with it anyway, but that's Parataxis. And Parataxis, if you break down the etymology, is para, comes from para, which means beside, and tasign, which means to arrange. So arranging things side by side. So again, like this happens in film, this happens in visual art, this happens in poetry. It can be used across genres and mediums. But it is having one image juxtaposed right next to another image or phrase, next to another phrase, without using transitional language. So you can see how this puts a lot of focus on the image, right? But it asks the reader to make that connection for themselves. It demands the reader engage in the meaning-making process more actively. And this, I think we can go ahead and say, is more common to poetry than prose. That doesn't mean it can't happen in prose. And it might, I don't know, we might even be able to argue that it's inherent to the work that poetry does. Parataxis is, again, it's not something Pound invented. It's inherent in the haiku form, so it's also not like a Western phenomenon. And I want to look at one poem that you read for today that will help us better understand and discuss Parataxis. So, Ezra Pound's In a Station of the Metro is definitely borrowing from the tradition of the haiku and is a great example of Parataxis. I'm going to go ahead and read it and talk a little about it. So it's 3 lines long, it's super short. And I consider the title to be a part of that, a part of the poem. In a station of the metro, the apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. So first, you know, I think something to keep in mind, this was written in 1913. The metro system in Paris, where this was written, opened in 1900. So the metro was this fairly new phenomenon. We know that we're in this urban setting. And, you know, like SLP and I have the language that we've used in workshop, I would like to think about what is the world of the poem, or what work is the poem doing to build that world. And the world of this poem is fascinating, right? The apparition, that word apparition, it does, of course, mean to appear, right? This creates this appearance, but it's also ghostly. An apparition is a ghost. So what kind of mood are we getting from this poem is one way to start thinking about the world that it's building. What is the emotional quality of that line, the apparition of these faces in the crowd? I think it's important to note that it's these faces, not those, not just faces. It feels like it is about choosing, right? The speaker's choosing which faces he's pointing out. Noticing, maybe wonder is a part of that. But it feels a little emotionally removed, right? Like the apparition of these faces in the crowd. And the next line, petals on a wet black bough, of course, entirely colors the way that we're viewing this scene. The sort of image that I'm getting from that is rain, that it's just recently rained. And that makes it easier to see the faces as apparitions, right? Maybe blurry, the way that like something impressionistic in visual arts might be, that these faces might be blurred through the rain. But I also want to think about, what kind of tree is this? I'm curious what kind of tree you see with petals on a wet black bough. I see a cherry tree. That black bough suddenly makes me see petals as pink, right? So I'm seeing these like very delicate pink petals on the bark, right? On this like dark black bark of the tree on the bough. I think it's another good question, like, do we see the bough as attached to the tree? Do we see it as separate from the tree? Do we see the petals individually on the trunk, on the bough itself? Or are they a part of like a bud? And, you know, we don't have a lot of information here, but I can't justify, I guess I'm still seeing the bough as attached. I don't feel like something so violent has happened that it's broken off, but I don't know. The petals, though, the petals I think I see as, you know, unattached from the bud, as singular and separate and individually on the bough. And that creates a very specific mood and emotional tone, right? We have this delicate nature of the petal against the texture of the rough bark of the black bough. And that makes me see the faces in the crowd quite differently. I see their vulnerability. I see their humanity. I see these outside forces that they can't control. And I see something beautiful, whereas before it seemed just ghostly. And this is an example where we're not given any comparing words, we're not given any transitional language, right? But we just have these two lines juxtaposed next to each other. And that, my friends, is one very fine example of Parataxis. Uh,